So in our previous year, in our previous two shiurim, when we spoke about Berachas Hamazon, I stressed that the only bracha which Kuli Alma Moedim is a bracha D'Oraisa is Berachas Hamazon. Regarding Berachas HaTorah, it is somewhat of a question. So the Gemara Brachas Chafara from Beis Darshans Kishemesh Emekro Havu Goydel Elokeinu. That is the source from which we learn that there is a mitzvah of Berachas HaTorah. Are we dealing with a mitzvah D'Oraisa, and it's a drasha Gemura, or might it be an asmachta and we're dealing with a mitzvah D'Rabbanan? For some reason, the Rambam in Sefer HaMitzvahs and Minyan HaMitzvahs, the Rambam does not count the mitzvah of Berachas HaTorah. It is interesting. He discusses Berachas HaTorah, but it is only agav Berachas Hamazon. So it's not that he doesn't mention Berachas HaTorah, but when he dedicates a slat to Berachas Hamazon, he also mentions Berachas HaTorah, Kishem Sheba Barach Hamazon, Kachma Barach HaTorah, but we do not find one of the Taryag in the meaning of the Rambam, Berachas HaTorah, and the Ramban wonders. So by this time, you're all familiar with the structure of Sefer HaMitzvahs. We have Mitzvahs Aseh and Mitzvahs Votase, and then the Ramban comes along, and he strikes out Kama V'Kama mitzvahs that the Rambam does count, and he puts in others that the Rambam omits. So the Ramban, mitzvahs Aseh Tes Vav, wonders, why did the Rambam omit Berachas HaTorah? So the Ramban clearly maintains Berachas HaTorah is a mitzvah D'Oraisa, just like Berachas Hamazon is a mitzvah D'Oraisa. And the source of Berachas HaTorah is the pasuk in Parshas V'Zos HaBracha. Moshe Rabbeinu, before teaching Klal Yisrael Shiras Hazinu, Moshe Rabbeinu says, Ki Shemesh Emekro Havu Goydel Elokeinu. And it is from this pasuk that we learn the mitzvah of Berachas HaTorah. So why did the Rambam skip Berachas HaTorah? Some commentators argue, like the Kiryas Sefer. One of the most important of the Rambam is the Kiryas Sefer, the Mabit. So the Mabit argues that according to the Rambam, Berachas HaTorah is one of the Chelke mitzvah of Talmud Torah. It is a D'Oraisa, but it's not a mitzvah b'fnei atzma, and that is why we don't find it in the magical list of Taryag mitzvahs. I think the interpretation of the Kiryas Sefer, the Mabit, is not very misyashav alalev, is not very reasonable. We do not find elsewhere that a bracha would be part of a mitzvah, l'choyre mitzvah, l'chud v'bracha l'chud, mahechet teisa, to say that Berachas HaTorah is part of mitzvahs Talmud Torah. Especially, it isn't in the context of ikar mitzvahs Talmud Torah. Shiras Hazinu is not ikar Torah. And the mitzvah of Talmud Torah we learn from V'shirantam l'bonacho, v'nimadatam oisam, u'shmartam l'asosam. So it is unreasonable to say that Berachas HaTorah is part of mitzvah Talmud Torah. When we discuss Berachas HaMitzvah, I wrote an Arichus Gedolah regarding Berachas HaMitzvah. Is Berachas HaMitzvah as if part of each and every mitzvah, or is it a milta achrita? A davar b'fnei atzmo stand for itself, but that discussion is only about the Rabbanon. If Berachas HaTorah is a D'Oraisa, it is very unreasonable to say it's part of mitzvah Talmud Torah. After all, bracha is not Talmud. So it's more reasonable to accept the interpretation of the Ramban. According to the Ramban, Shittas HaRambam, Berachas HaTorah is midrabbanon, and the drosh is an asmachta b'yalma. And therefore, according to the Rambam, the only bracha D'Oraisa would be Berachas Hamazon, and Berachas HaTorah is midrabbanon, like all the other Berachos HaMitzvah. However, the Ramban argues Berachas HaTorah is D'Oraisa. I don't want to go into a lengthy discussion, but Lanias Daiti, most of the poskim maintain Berachas HaTorah is a mitzvah D'Oraisa, and that seems to be the opinion of the Beis Yosef as well in Siman Mem Zayin. How do we define Berachas HaTorah? And the question is relevant whether it's the Rabbanon or D'Oraisa. How do we define Berachas HaTorah? So because I don't know whether next Sunday we'll have a shiur, and if we will it be once again on Berchus HaTorah or not. But I want to
I think, so until the HaRav, I think we're going to divide Berchus HaTorah with your Rishus into two parts, since you have such a vast amount of information.
Okay, fantastic. And therefore today, I will be mekatze in some aspects, because I do want to discuss the relevant Shaila Halacha L'Maaseh regarding Berchus HaTorah Shavuos in the morning. And therefore, I will leave some of our discussions to the next year, B'siyata D'Shmaya B'li Neder, Be'ezes Hashem Yisborach, that we'll have right after Shavuos. So the question is, how do we define Berchus HaTorah, whether it's the Oraisa or the Rabbanon? In the Rambam, the beginning of Hilchos Brochos, the Rambam says that there are 3 Gedorim of Brochos. Abu Darham adds number 4 different Gedorim. So according to the Rambam, what are the 3 different Gedorim in Brochos? Berchus HaMitzvah, Berchus HaNehenen, and Berchus HaShevach. All the mitzvahs must fit into one of these 3 categories. Berchus HaMitzvah, the many brochas we say before the performance of many, many mitzvahs. Berchus HaNehenen are, as you all know, we spoke about Berchus HaNehenen at length. All the brochas one is to say before partaking of any food. Brocha Rishona and Brocha Achrona, Berchus HaShevach, are actually divided into 2 different subcategories, subtitles. Berchus HaShevach and Berchus HaHoidoya. Some brochas are directly associated with our salvation, and that is giving personal thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Berchus HaGoimel. HaGoimel HaChasiyot Toim, when a person is salvaged, when his life was in danger and he was saved. Shechiyanu, Pri Chodosh, Kelem Chadoshim. These are defined as Berchus Hoidoyim, but there are many brochas that are Berchus HaShevach, not associated with your personal benefit, pleasure, experience. She'oseli neis b'mokom hazeh is a personal bracha. She'oso lonu neis b'mokom hazeh is Berchus HaShevach. Koichoi v'gvurose molei olam, oise maase bereishis. Berchus HaShachar could either fit into Berchus HaDoya or Berchus HaShevach. But the Rambam does not divide them into 2 categories. These are subtitles. But in essence, it's the same Yesod. It's not Berchus HaNehenen, it's not Berchus HaMitzvah, Berchus HaShevach. Comes along Abu Darham, and Abu Darham says that we have a totally distinct and different category, and that is Berchus HaTfilah. What are Berchus HaTfilah? Primarily, Brochos and Tzoyos of Tfilas U'Amida, of the Shemoneh Esrei. What is unique about Berchus HaTfilah is it's not only singing the praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and offering, expressing gratitude and thanks, it is also asking bakashos. So what comes to mind? All the brochas and tzoyos of the Shemoneh Esrei. Refu'enu atu chaynein la'odam das, hashiveni uvinu rasayaseho, uvnei Yerushalayim yira kodesh. These are bakashos. And that is unique about Berchus HaTfilah. You remember another bracha? The middle bracha in Berchus HaTorah. V'arevnu Hashem Elokeinu es divrei terosecho b'finu, v'niya anachnu v'tzetzuenu. That is Berchus HaTfilah. So how do we define the mitzvah of Berchus HaTorah? Is it essentially Berchus HaShevach or Berchus HaMitzvah? The Brisker Rav quotes his great father, Reb Chaim Brisker, and maybe in our next year we'll deal with this at greater length. So the Brisker Rav quotes his great father as saying that Berchus HaTorah is not associated with mitzvahs Talmud Torah, but rather with a cheftza of Torah. So if it's brisk, it's got to be cheftza or gavra. So the way the Brisker Rav quotes his father is the cheftza of Talmud Torah, which means it is more similar to Berchus HaShevach. So if Berchus HaTorah is the Weiss, according to the Shittas Ramban, I don't think it would be correct to ask, is it Berchus HaMitzvah or Berchus HaShevach? Because both categories, both Berchas Mitzvah and Berchas Shevach are Midrabanan. We're dealing with the Mitzvah D'Oraisa. So if Berchas Torah is D'Rabbanan, based on Shittas Rambam, then we could simply ask, what is Berchas Torah? Is it Berchas Shevach or is it Berchas Mitzvah? If it's a Bracha D'Oraisa, it's still essentially the same question, but we just need to phrase it differently. Mashmo is Dorshan Ike Beineu, but it's the same question. What is the essence of Berchas Torah? Is it associated with Mitzvahs Talmud Torah or with Cheftzeh Shel Torah? I think both the Ramban and the Ramban make it very clear it's not similar to Berchas Mitzvah. It is closer associated with Berchas Shevach because I mentioned before, the Rambam does not count Berchas Torah as a mitzvah b'fnei atzma, but he includes Berchas Torah with Berchas Hamazon, which clearly would seem to indicate that they have something in common. It's not reasonable that the Rambam includes Berchas Torah and Berchas Hamazon just because it's the only Bracha D'Oraisa. So why doesn't the Rambam put in all the Berchas HaMitzvahs and Berchas HaNahen and Berchas HaShevach together with Berchas HaMazon? So it seems to be clear from the Rambam and from the Ramban. So I didn't open a Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Rambam on my table, and I don't want to take your time and do it right now. But the Ramban in Mitzvah Tezvav Sheshochach HaRav, when the Rambam adds in Mitzvah Tezvav Shechachas HaRav, when the Rambam adds Berchas Torah, the Rambam clearly says that Berchas Torah is thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shebocho Bano Makroam V'Nosam Lanu Estarosai, just like we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu ala Mazon v'ala Oretz HaToivo. So both the Rambam and the Ramban draw this parallel, this similarity between Berchas Hamazon and Berchas Torah. So it would seem obvious from the Rambam and the Ramban that in essence, Berchas Torah is associated with Chiras Chal Yisrael, Nesinas Torah, and Lav Dafka with Kiyum Mitzvahs Talmud Torah. And this seems to have many nafkaminas. La'aniyas daiti, and I made this clear in a few different sources in my Svarim. So, Minchas Osher Moedim Chele Gimel, one of our first Shiurim, since we had this virtual Yarchei Kallah, I was a Ish B'Soyer. I think you were the first ones to hear the B'Soyer that the new Sefer came out, Chele Gimel Minchas Osher Moedim, which is on Pesach, Tzvias, Urim, and Shavuos. So I wrote, that's the latest version, but I also wrote about this in Minchas Osher Chumash Devorim and Parshas V'Zeis Brocha, and Minchas Osher and Talmud Torah. Baruch Hashem, I think I have 31 or 32 Sforim. I stopped counting some time ago. So I wrote about the Sugya Kama Pa'omim. And I think it's a machlokes between the Beis Yosef and the Gra. How do we define Berchas Torah? Mem Zayin Siv Daled. The Shulchan Aruch Paskins, Amhara B'divrei Torah, Einoi Mevorech. You do not need to say Berchas Torah on Hirur. It's only if you speak out Torah, if you verbalize and vocalize Torah. On Hirur Alev, you do not need to say Berchas Torah. And the Vilna Gaon in Bir Agro disagrees, and he says, V'hogiso b'yoyim v'laylo. And what does V'hogiso mean? Yirotz nimrep yiveheg yoyim libi. So it is clear you're Makayim the mitzvah of Torah even on Hegyon and Lev, so why wouldn't you say Berchas Torah? Lani is daiti, my interpretation would be, according to the Gaon, Berchas Torah is clearly associated with mitzvahs Talmud Torah, and it is similar to Berchas HaMitzvah, and that's why the Gaon justly argues, if you have a mitzvah of Talmud Torah, Behirur, why wouldn't you say Berchas Torah Behirur? How would I understand the Beis Yosef? The Beis Yosef says, what does it have to do with mitzvahs Talmud Torah? I agree that one has a mitzvah of Talmud Torah Behirur, but Berchas Torah has nothing to do with the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Berchas Torah is on the Cheftzeh of Torah. And for some reason, the Beis Yosef maintains Just like other brachas, you don't say a bracha only on a maisa. Same regarding Berachas HaTorah. Yes, I don't think the Beis Yosef would disagree with the Gaon. There is a mitzvah on Hirur b'divrei Torah, definitely. Lo k'divrei Oimrim, that there is no mitzvah of Hirur Alev. Of course there's a mitzvah Hirur Alev. But Berachas HaTorah is not associated with mitzvahs Talmud Torah. It's associated with the chefs of Talmud Torah. Ki Shem Hashem ekru havu goydel le'elokeinu. So let me just give you a very fascinating anecdote, a historical anecdote, and this is a big chiddush. Bechaya Adam was a Talmud of the Noida B'Yehuda, but he was a mechutim with the Goin. And since he came to know the Goin, he became one of his greatest chassidim and talmidim. The way the Chayodim relates to the Goin, we see from his introduction to the Sefer Zichru Toras Moshe. It's not a very well-known Sefer. The two fundamental, monumental works of the Chayodim are Chayodim and Orachaim, and Chochmas Odom and Yeredeya. But one of his great forms is Zichru Toras Moshe and Chashavs. An introduction to this Sefer, he writes about the Goin. Moededik. And the Chayodim constantly quotes the Goin. His second Sefer, which he published after the first, is Chochmas Odom and Yeredeya. So Chayodim and Orachaim comes together with Nishmas Odom, which is an elaboration and more lumdus, broader discussions. Chayodim is the psak, and Nishmas Odom is the discussion. The same is the structure Sefer on Yeredeya. It's Chochmas Odom and Binas Odom. So, in the first print of Chaya Odom, but only in the very first print, second print, which was Bechayav, he omitted it, took it out. But I saw the first print. And on the Shar, there's an apology. And he writes, you readers and learners of my Sefer would wonder, why don't I quote the Goin even once in this Sefer? I quoted him constantly in my first Sefer, Chayodim and Shulchan Aruch Orachaim. So you will wonder, what happened? Why don't I bring him in this Sefer? You should blame yourself, he writes, don't blame me. Because after my first Sefer came out, I was attacked. How I dare to disagree with the Goin. So on my second Sefer, I decided I don't have any koyach to your attacks. So I prefer, I'm not going to quote him at all, so I don't have to agree or disagree with him. And don't come to me with kindness, just blame yourselves. Which is a fascinating and somewhat shocking document. Goes back 200 years, one of the greatest Gedolim. And my feeling is, whom is he angry with? Who hurt his feelings? Probably it was Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chever, who wasn't really a Talmud of the Gaon, he was a Talmud of the Gaon's Talmidim. So in Nishmas Adam Sementes, the Chayodim quotes this very same achloikas between the Shulchan Aruch and the Gaon that we just discussed. And in Chayodim he paskins and according to the Beis Yosef, to the Shulchan Aruch, that a Maharav Divrei Torah does not need to say Berachas HaTorah. So in Nishmas Adam, he quotes the Gaon. He rejects the Gaon's argument. He agrees with the Shulchan Aruch. And a Shalas Teshuvas Binyan Olam, that's the Shalas Teshuvas of Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chever. Who was Rabbi Yitzchak Isaac Chever? He was a Talmud of Reb Mendel Mishklov. And he was best known for his Kabbalah. He was number one authority in the Kabbalah of the Vilna Gaon, and most of his Sforim are in Kabbalah. But he also was one of the Gedolim in Halacha, as we see in Shalas Teshuvas Binyan Olam. So in Binyan Olam, Siman Vav Orachaim, he attacks the Chayodim. How do you dare to be choilek on the Vilna Gaon? How do you dare to be choilek on our great Rebbe? I think that was the reason for the shocking declaration of the Chayodam in the very beginning of Sefer Chochma Sodom, in which he says, you hurt my feelings, you offended me, so I prefer not quoting the Goan at all, so you won't come to me with kindness. So maybe at another opportunity, I will speak at greater length of the philosophical approach. Who was right? Does a Talmud have the privilege and the right to be choylek on his great Rebbe, or would that be considered offensive or priestess covered? This is an interesting discussion, but let's leave it for another opportunity. So anyway, so the Shulchan Aruch paskins, a HaRav b'divrei Torah potem berachos HaTorah, and the Gaon says a HaRav b'divrei Torah chayiv. The argument of the Gaon is, you have a mitzvah, why wouldn't you say a bracha? The way I understand the Shulchan Aruch B'Bes Yosef, mitzvah lachid v'bracha lachud. The bracha is not associated with a mitzvah. It is, to use the Briskarov's terminology, Hagdoras Chefze Shel Torah. And the Shulchan Aruch and the Grol is Shitosam in that very same siman, at the end of the siman. Sif Daled and Sif Yud Daled. What do we learn in Sif Yud Daled? Soif Siman Mem Zayin. Shulchan Aruch says, Noshim mevorchos berachos HaTorah. Women are chayav to say berachos HaTorah. And the Gaon once again disagrees. And the Gaon quotes the Gemara in Kedushin Daf Chavtes. V'limadetem oisem es b'neichem v'lo es b'noisechem. Women are exempt from the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, so why would they say berachos HaTorah? And to me, the Gaon HaShitose and the Shulchan Aruch HaShitose, the Gaon HaShitose, the Gaon says, berachos HaTorah is similar to berachos HaMitzvah. It is associated with mitzvahs Talmud Torah. And if Noshim are potter for mitzvahs Talmud Torah, why would they say berachos HaTorah? Beis Yosef l'shitosoi. It is not associated with a mitzvah. It has nothing to do with mitzvahs Talmud Torah. So in Beis Yosef, we find the source and the rationale to this psak. Why do Noshim need to say berachos HaTorah? And the Beis Yosef quotes the Sefer Agudah, and he gives two different reasons. Reason number one, Noshim need to learn some parts of Torah. They need to learn their halachas. They need to learn Hilchos Neder. They need to learn Hilchos Kallah. They need to learn the fundamentals in Hilchos Shabbos. And therefore, they need to say berachos HaTorah. They learn the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, but nevertheless, they still need to learn Torah. And they also daven and they say karbona, so therefore they need to say berachos HaTorah. So once again, the Beis Yosef definitely would agree with the Gra that Noshim are potter from Talmud Torah. But according to the Beis Yosef, berachos HaTorah has nothing to do with mitzvahs Talmud Torah. It has to do with the chefetz of Torah. If they need to learn, they need to say the bracha. When you learn Torah, you say berachos HaTorah, regardless of whether you have a mitzvah or not. So each and every one of these two different approaches and definitions, yesh bo kula v'yesh bo chumra. If we say berachos HaTorah is associated with mitzvahs Talmud Torah, lagabe noshim it's a kula, lagabe hirhur it's a chumra. If we say berachos HaTorah has nothing to do with a mitzvah, lagabe hirhur it's a chumra, lagabe hirhur it's a kula, lagabe noshim it's a chumra. So I think that the Shulchan Aruch and the Gaon and both these machlokes are l'shitasa. And the fundamental question is, how do we define mitzvahs berachos HaTorah? If it's a mitzvah derabanan, and it's reasonable to assume that according to the Rambam we're dealing with a mitzvah derabanan, then the very simple question would be, is it berachos HaMitzvah or berachos HaShevach? If it's a mitzvah d'oraisa, same question, slightly different formulation. Is it similar to berachos HaMitzvah? And we say the bracha on mitzvahs Talmud Torah, or is it more similar to berachos HaShevach? And berachos HaShevach are always associated with a certain experience. What you see, what you feel, what you benefit. So the same regarding berachos HaTorah. When you experience and the unbelievable delight and pleasure of Talmud Torah, you need to give Shir v'Shevach v'Hodoya to HaKadosh Baruch Hu shebacha banu mekol ha'amim v'nosam lanu es Torosei. And maybe there is another sif in Shulchan Aruch and another machlokes, which is based on the same two different interpretations. And this brings us to Sif Yud Aleph. Sif Yud Aleph, the Shulchan Aruch writes, Shinas kva b'tzohorayim have hefsek. Yesh oimrim deloi have hefsek. V'chein nahagu. So if a person sleeps in the afternoon, and many people take a nap in the afternoon, I think in Etzisol it's more common than in America. So when you take a nap in the afternoon, and it's a Shinas Chvad, you need to say Berchas HaTorah when you wake up. Machlokes Rishonim. So the Mechaber brings both opinions. Have hefsek, yesham and v'lav hefsek, v'chein nahagu. What's the question? Machlokes Rosh and Rabbeinu Tam. According to the Rosh, what determines the chiyuv of Berchas HaTorah is hefsek. You said Berchas HaTorah, and then you have a hefsek, you need to say the brocha again. Just like Berchas HaNahanan, Berchas HaMitzvah. You said the brocha you learned, and then you had a hefsek gomer. You need to say the brocha again. Rabbeinu Tam says Berchas HaTorah has nothing to do with hefsek. Berchas HaTorah has to do with each and every day. Every morning, you get up in the morning, you need to say Berchas HaTorah, and Berchas HaTorah is similar to Berchos HaShachar. That's Rabbeinu Tam, and therefore, even though you slept an hour or 2 hours in the afternoon, you don't need to say Berchas HaTorah. You said in the morning, and that keeps you going till the other day in the morning, just like Berchas HaShachar. What is the essence of this machlokes? I think it would be very reasonable to argue the same. Because if Berchas HaTorah is on mitzvahs Talmud Torah, it would be so reasonable to follow the logic of the Rosh, just like any other mitzvah. If you said a brocha and then you have a hefsek gomer, you need to say the brocha again. I don't want to go into details of Berchas HaMitzvah, but there's a difference between a hefsek between the brocha and the first mitzvah, or a hefsek between one mitzvah and the other. For instance, so if I said a brocha on any mitzvah, and I spoke one word, that's a hefsek. Brocha levatonians need to say the brocha again. That is correct if I was mafsik between Berchas HaMatzah and Achilas Matzah, and Atilas Lulav and Atilas Lulav, Mikra Megillah, Tkiyas Shofar. But if a person made a brocha on a shchita, and the shochet is working all day, so if you made a hefsek between the brocha and the first behemoth of his shechts, one word is a hefsek, brocha levatona. But if he spoke between one chicken and the other, one animal and the other, that's not a hefsek. But if he went to sleep, or he went to do shopping for an hour or two, that's a hefsek. And the same is regarding tzitzis. But we won't go into many details. If you made a hefsek between berchas tzitzis and the atifa, even one word is enough, it's a hefsek. But if you weren't mafsek between the brocha and atifa, but then you took off your tzitzis and you went to the bathroom, even though you spoke with a friend, that's not a hefsek. It needs to be a substantial hefsek. But anyway, if it's berchas mitzvah, it is dependent on hefsek. The fact that Rabbeinu Tam says berchas HaTorah is like berchas HaShachar, and therefore it doesn't depend on hefsek at all, it has to do with the day. I think that proves very clearly that according to Rabbeinu Tam, it's berchas HaShevach and not berchas HaMitzvah. And it is one of those berchas HaShevach that is not directly associated with experience, like berchas HaShachar. These are brachas we say every day in the morning. Because these brachas are berchas HaShevach on routine, not on the extraordinary. It's not when you see majestic mountains or huge oceans, or you see lightning and thunder. Berchas Shachar are about the daily routine, but they're Berchas Shevach, and that's why we say them every day. So according to the Rabbeinu Tam, the same would be Berchas Torah. It's part of our daily routine. What do we do every day? We get up in the morning. So my understanding would be, according to the Rabbeinu Tam, it's Berchas Shevach. According to the Rosh, Berchas HaMitzvah. And that is the Machlokes. I just want to make a very interesting comment. So we explained the Machlokes Beis Yosef Gra. Is it Berchas Shevach or Berchas HaMitzvah? Rabbeinu Tam Rosh, Berchas Shevach or Berchas HaMitzvah. But when we just examine the content of Berchas Torah, well, there are two different brachas. Isn't it clear that bracha number one is Berchas HaMitzvah, bracha number two is Berchas Shevach? Isn't that clear? The first bracha is Asher Kiddishonu b'mitzvois v'tzivono lasek b'divrei Torah. And that is the fundamental, the basic formulation of all the Berchas HaMitzvahs. Asher Kiddishonu b'mitzvois. And the second bracha is Asher Bochar Bono Mekol Oamim. It's not Asher Kiddishonu b'mitzvois. So that clearly is Berchas Shevach. So why don't we find any one of the great poskim to say, Hamaharer b'divrei Torah should say bracha number one and not bracha number two. Noshim should say bracha number two and not bracha number one. If a person was mafsik, he should say Asher Kiddishonu, but he shouldn't say Asher Bochar Bono till tomorrow in the morning. So why don't we simply differentiate between first bracha and second bracha? This is a fascinating question which troubles me for many, many, many years. So the only explanation I could give is, yes, technically, in detail, it is clear that these two brachas are, one is Berchas Mitzvah and the other is Berchas Shevach. But fundamentally, Berchas HaTorah is one mitzvah, especially according to most Rishonim that it's the Uraisa. It is only Anshe Knesset Agdola, later generation, formulated two brachas. But we're dealing with one mitzvah, and therefore we need to determine what is the essence of the mitzvah. And if the essence of the mitzvah is on mitzvahs Talmud Torah, then even bracha number two has the halachas and agdoras of Berchas HaMitzvah. If the essence of the mitzvah is on cheftzeh shel Torah, then even bracha number one has the halachas and the dinim of Berchas Shevach. Regardless of what seems clear as daylight, based on the nusach of the bracha, the formula of the bracha, that achein, yes, bracha number one is clearly Berchas HaMitzvah, because we say Asher Kiddishonu b'mitzvois v'tzivono lasek b'divrei Torah, while bracha number two is clearly Berchas Shevach, and that is Asher Bochar Bono Mekol Oamim v'nosan lanu es Torahos. And now, towards the end of today's shir, let's ask the question regarding Shavuos. So you're up all night. What do you do in the morning? This question is clearly dependent upon the two shittas, two opinions that we just quoted from Sifud Aleph and Samem Mem Zayin, Shinas Sabit Zohorayim. And these two questions are two different sides of the same coin. If we say it depends on hefsek, you are up all night and you have no hefsek, so you don't need to say the bracha in the morning. If it does not depend on hefsek, it depends on the day, then whether you were mafsek or not, you learned all night, but it's a new day. New sunrise. It's a new day. So you need to say the brachas. So if the Shulchan says, Yesh oimrim, de lo hefsek v'chein nahadu, and the minig is we do not say Berchas Torah after one sleeps in the afternoon. So that means our minig assumes that it has not to do with hefsek, but rather with the day. So wouldn't it be clear that the very same minig would dictate that we should say Birchas Torah in the morning? Even though there was no hefsek, you didn't sleep. New day, new bracha. But not necessarily. Not necessarily. So the Magen Avraham both in Tov Tzadik Daled and in Semem Mem Zayin. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger on the spot in Semem Mem Zayin. So what they argue is maybe the minig that we don't say Birchas Torah after an afternoon nap is not because the halacha is Keshitas Rabbeinu Tam, but rather Safek Brochas Lakula. It's a Safek. And I think this argument is very convincing. Because the lashon of the Shulchan Aruch is Shinas Ekava B'Tzoraim Have Hefsek V'Yesh Oimrim Delo Have Hefsek. So usually we know when the Machaber brings one opinion B'Stoma and the other opinion V'Yesh Oimrim Ika Aloche Keshita Rishoino. But this is an exception. The Machaber writes Kein Nagu. So it would be reasonable to argue Kein Nagu is not a psak, it's a minag. Even though the Natiyah of the Shulchan Aruch is the paskin according to the Shita Rishono. The opinion of the Rosh, that a hefsek necessitates a brocha. But the minig is based on Rabbeinu Tam, and maybe that is because Sofek brochas lakula. And if that's the case, if we are choishish to Shittas Rabbeinu Tam, kal v'choyma, we need to be choishish Shittas Rosh, and therefore not to say a brocha in the morning. So that is why the Magen Avraham says it is better to be yoitze in the morning with another person that did sleep by night, and he should be yoitze all the others that were up all night. But this is an eitzah which is somewhat, I would say, uncomfortable. What do I mean? In one of our previous Shiurim, I said, which bracha do we usually say with greater kavanah? Birchas Ilonis, Chodesh Nisan, or Birchas Torah? And I said, well, each and every one of us could testify on his own experience. Of course, you say Birchas Ilonis with greater kavanah once a year. You go 5 times to your neighbor's yard. Is the tree blossoming already? And when you notice those very first little flowers, you take your kids, the entire family, you walk 10 minutes to those 2 atzei pri, you put on your gartel and you say the bracha with your children. It's beautiful. Birchas Torah you say every day in the morning when you're still half asleep, you're still groggy, and you say Birchas Torah. So it is only once a year you were up all night. You didn't speak the Vorim B'Teilim. You learned Torah all night. Comes in the morning. And you really want to say, Birchas Torah ma'umke de liebe. This is a magnificent like no other. So when do we have the opportunity, like Shavuos in the morning, to say Birchas Torah after learning all night? And then comes along the Magen Avraham and he says, no, be yaitze with someone else. With whom? With the guy that slept all night. Doesn't feel right. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger comes with a spark of genius. And Agos Rabbi Akiva Eiger Semem Mem Zayin. We find the same in Zichron Yehuda. Zichron Yehuda is the Menhogim and the Toldois of Rav Meir Ash. I am an anicle of Rav Meir Ash. He was the greatest Talmud of the Sam Sofer, the Ungvar HaRav, Shalas HaTshuvas Imrei Eish. So he came up with the same idea as we find in Sefer Zichron Yehuda. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger and the Maram Ash say, if you sleep Erev Shavuos in the afternoon, then Mimanav Shach, Shavuos in the morning, you could say a bracha. Mimanav Shach. According to the Rosh, if it depends on Hefsek, you already were Mechuyev yesterday in the afternoon to say a bracha. But you didn't. Because of Choshesh to Rabbeinu Tam. According to Rabbeinu Tam, you need to say a bracha in the morning. But we usually don't, because we're Choshesh to the Rosh. But if you slept Erev Shavuos, and then you're up all night, Mimanav Shach, in the morning you could say Birchas Torah. which is really a spark of genius. But then others come along and say, but you need to be mechaven in the Berachos Krishma, HaRav is to be Patra Berachos HaTorah. And I say, nobody is mechaven by HaRav Berachos HaTorah all year round. So why would you do a Dafke Reshuos just to dash the Bekiva Eges Eitzah? Doesn't make sense. Lanias Daiti, and in many shuls, there is nobody coming in the morning that slept by night. So you don't have this option of being yoitza with a person that slept by night. In our shuls, Baruch Hashem, Achshel Dora. And in most of our shuls, people are up all night and there's nobody coming that slept by night and he comes to daven with an eights in the morning. So my psak is, yes, you could say Berachos HaTorah in the morning, even if you didn't sleep Erev Shavuos, Kal v'chomer if you did sleep Erev Shavuos. But this is an interesting discussion.